March 23rd, 2003, and we're here today with Rimvydas Sidrys, who's my dad, and Joey and Mikey's grandfather. And today we're going to interview him and discuss his life, his birth in Lithuania, and the circumstances of his arrival in the United States, and what happened in World War II, and then we'll go on to talk about the family tree. So the first thing we will look at is his photo album, which he created when, Dad?
Oh, when I was about 18 years old, that's when I started this album.
Now this says Tübingen, so that's where you went to medical school.
Yes.
But you were older than 18 by then, right?
No, by that time I was already 21, 22, yes.
Okay, so let's go ahead and open the first page here. And this says my youth, my childhood and youth, and the days of childhood and youth, scenes from the days of my childhood and youth. So much for my translation. What can you tell us about these pictures here?
Let's see, this is pictures from Lithuania. This is the famous Gate of Dawn in Vilnius.
Let me just adjust this slightly.
Yeah. This is the Cathedral of Vilnius, and this is the Three Crosses, also very famous, in Lithuania at least. The this are we focused on the Trakupilis. This is castle of
there it is.
Castle of Trakai.
Before the reconstruction.
Before the reconstruction, that was in the condition that I first saw it in the year of 1939.
Now you took these pictures with a box camera?
Yes.
Was it a Kodak or Russian made?
No, it was probably German made, just a rigid box camera.
And where did you get that? As a gift?
As a gift, my uncle gave it to me.
Uh-huh.
And I'm glad he did, because otherwise I wouldn't even have those memories.
Yeah. How old were you when you got this camera?
I probably was 16 years old or something like that. I can't remember exactly.
And we could tell you were a talented photographer even at that age. And then finally, this is Kaunas, Klaipėda, Kaunas.
Yes.
What's that cross?
That's just a monument for the for those who perished in the
Siberian
no,
deportations?
No, that was for fights for independence.
Okay. Let's go on here. I've actually labeled some of these pictures, and this is your father.
Yes.
Juozas, right?
He was a Sideravicius at that time. His name was full name and ancient. And this is my house in which I grew up.
And we're going to go visit that house next in about 10 days. And so this is at 48 Marionu Gatve,
yes,
at the corner of Marionu and
Liepų Alėja, that's Linden alley. And it looks quite different now. On both sides there are high-rise buildings, and this house is still stands, but it's in the middle between those high buildings and the orchard which surrounded that house really is destroyed completely.
And that's your father's orchard.
My father, he was passionate gardener, and he had about 40 different kind of trees, fruit trees mostly, in there. And
Now, how about the house itself? Did your father have that built?
Yes, he had it built. He
So-
supervised the building just about all the time.
Did they have
continuously.
construction companies that he hired, or how did he go about finding builders and carpenters and
Well,
architects?
you had to approach them individually. There was no big company at that time. Each one was this sort of trained in his own work, in his kind of work. But each was an individual master.
All right, and then how about this building here? What does that represent? Summer cottage
Oh,
in
this one?
Berčūnai?
Yes, this my father also built on his own and supervised the building, but that was later, approximately in 1935 or 36, something like that.
Now, where is Berčūnai on this map? Let's find
It's too small.
Panevėžys.
Panevėžys is here, and Berčūnai is just about 4 miles south of Panevėžys, south of the town of Panevėžys. It's not going to show here in this map because this
Okay.
is Panevėžys and this is just a little bit south.
All right, well, I do have a bigger map here. Did you spend
Yes,
a lot of
let's
time
see.
there at Berčūnai?
In summer, yes. I wonder if it's going to show.
Here's Panevėžys. Let me get that
Panevėžys.
centered on the map
Yeah.
here.
Because
There it
it's
is.
really not a town, not a locality. No, it's not.
But it was south of
Here it
Panevėžys?
is,
There it
yeah.
is. Okay,
Yeah.
west.
Actually, it's west. Yes.
Right off
Yeah.
the border.
Yeah.
Is this a highway?
No, that's a railway.
Okay, so Berčūnai. It's
This is railway.
between Naujamiestis and Panevėžys.
Yes. The house is still standing over there. It was more than a cottage, but it was a house, but it was not adapted for living in winter, just
Okay.
for summer.
And then what else can you tell us about the area where you grew up, Panevėžys? What are some of the highlights in that
Well,
area?
actually, I have to refer to Rokiškis, which is over here. Oh, barely, where is Rokiškis? Do you see it? Searching for it.
Let's turn this off for a second. There, we found Rokiškis near the border between, what is this, Latvia?
Yeah, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we used to go for most of the summer. We spent most of the summers, especially before we got this summer cottage, summer house in Berčūnai. This is just a little bit south of Rokiškis is a village of Kraštai, where my mother was born. And her folks were still living there, and we used to go and help them in summer.
So your mother was born in what town? Or
This is
village?
not a town, it
Village
was
or
just-
farm, Kaimas.
Yes, kind
Just
of. Yeah.
just south of Rokiškis.
Yeah.
And that's Aukštaitija?
Oh yes, of course. The whole region is Aukštaitija.
So where would you say this Kaimas was
Um,
on this map?
do you see Panemunėlis? I'm
Yeah.
trying.
Panemunėlis is right here.
Panemunėlis is here. This is the little town where with the church where my mother used to go to church, and her uncle was priest in that church, and he really took care of my mother's education. He taught her basics of language, of Russian language, because in order to get an education, you have to learn Russian at that time. When my mother was born, and when she grew up till the age of she was about 26 years old when when the Lithuania gained independence, and then everything was in Lithuanian. But when she was small, she had to learn Russian. And the priest, her uncle, whose name was Katelė, he took her under his wing, so to speak. And this is really just like second home to me, mother's home.
Uh-huh.
So this is all in Aukštaitija, in Rytų Aukštaitija, in eastern highlands of Lithuania. Now my father was born quite far away from my mother's. He was born in this, again, he was, should I continue?
Sure.
He was born in, again, in a village.
In a kaimas?
Yeah, Kaimas.
Kaimas means farm.
Yeah. Vienkiemis really means farm. Kaimas is more than just one farm. It's a group of farmers. And he grew up in this, again, this is shows where the church was in. At that time the church was center of activity, and this is where his home.
Grishkabudis.
Grishkabudis.
Let's go ahead and circle that. Where is it?
Yeah, Grishkabudis.
Okay.
The next bigger town is Šakiai, where all the offices were. Center of the region was Šakiai, right here.
Okay.
So we also visited his father's ancient home.
Tėvynė.
Yeah, but not as often as mother's. As
Now what's this region called of Lithuania?
Suvalkija.
Suvalkija.
Yeah, yeah.
And did they have different accents in the different regions?
Yes, they did, and Suvalkija is really the main source of present Lithuanian language, because their accent, their dialect was selected as the basic Lithuanian language. Everybody who spoke a little bit different, they had to learn the official basic Lithuanian, the same which my father used to speak.
And now, did your mother then have a slightly different accent than your father?
Yes, slightly different.
So you could
That's
tell what region they were from then very easily.
Yeah, that's right. But we had no trouble. We still Lithuanian words, they were pronounced a little bit differently, but it was still basically the same words.
Because I know in Dzūkija, there's still a very strong accent within the country of Lithuania.
Yeah, especially in Žemaitija, they are different.
Žemaitija, is that where
They speak
Dzūkija
different.
is?
No, Dzūkija is here.
Uh-huh. But Žemaitija has a strong accent still?
Žemaitija is over here, all over, about close to half of Lithuania. It's Žemaitija, and they have accent which is really quite different.
So tell us more about your father and his parents, and then we'll maybe discuss it more when we go to the family tree.
Yeah. Well, my father was one of 5 children, and of course, just like my mother's father, and his father was farmer. He had a very nice home, which I was really, it was something to be worth.
Is the home still standing?
No, the Russians leveled it, just like my mother's home also. It was leveled completely. They created
Collective farms?
collective farms from it, and you cannot even find the place unless you know for sure. I couldn't have found the place where it was from. But it was a very nice home and surrounded by trees and by other buildings. And my father had a tragic fate because he was famous for being very strong, and during the German occupation.
You're talking about your father now?
Yes, no, I'm talking about my grandfather.
Your grandfather. Do we have a picture of him?
No, I'm afraid we don't have any.
You don't have any pictures of your
No,
grandfather?
No, not.
Now, what was his name?
His name, I believe, it was also Josas.
Okay, so this is your father that
No,
we're...
I'm sorry. His second name was Josas, but his first name was Salamonas.
That was your father, not your uncle that we're talking about?
No, that
Or
was
maybe your grandfather.
my grandfather.
Okay, so we don't have a picture of him, but this is your father.
Yeah, this is my father.
Josas.
Yeah.
But go ahead with your story of your grandfather.
Well, he during the German occupation, one German officer arranged a contest between his strong man and my grandfather's. And my grandfather was the victor of that contest. He just...
It was a wrestling match or a boxing match?
No, it was a wrestling match, and he just floored the German. So the German officer who arranged that match was so enraged by that fact that he just shot my father dead. Just to come.
Yeah.
That's the way Germans used to be when they were an occupant.
What year was that?
I believe it was in 1917. Yeah, either 1916 or 1917, I'm not sure, but that was during that occupation period.
About 4 years before you were born.
Yes.
So now tell us some more about your father. What did he do?
He also achieved education. He became a student in a teacher's seminary and graduated from it. And right after graduation, in 1914, when the war started and they were close to the border, the Germans started to occupy Lithuania. He retreated to Russia and wound up to be in Siberia, in Tomsk. So he was not a prisoner of something. He was not banished, but he voluntarily decided to go there to Siberia.
So he was not deported, he voluntarily went there sort of into hiding to avoid being drafted.
That's right, yes. And because in Siberia they had the different conditions, they didn't draft young men as much as in other regions. And he spent about 5 years in Siberia. And then when he came back...
Now, how old were you at that time? Or this was before you were born?
I wasn't born at that time yet.
So this was in what time period? During the Tsarist rule?
Some 1914 to 1919. Mm-hmm. In 1919 he came back to Lithuania.
And he was married at that time?
No, he only met my mother in Panevėžys, where he was assigned to be an inspector, which is sort of supervisor of schools or of teachers, and that's where he met. My mother was a teacher at that time, and they just met and they married soon afterwards.
How old were they when they got married?
They were both really 30 years old, I believe.
And what was his time in Siberia like? Who did he?
I know very little about his activities in Siberia. I think he was he was working in an office of some sort as a clerk.
And so when he returned to Lithuania, he did not return to his village, but he went to Panevėžys.
Well, he was assigned to that to the duty to that office in Panevėžys. First, he went to Kaunas. He expected to be assigned to his home region, but the chiefs that were really governing the educational activities at that time, they sent him to Panevėžys.
And how did your mother end up in Panevėžys?
Well, she also was in Russia during the same time. Again, she retreated when the front came close to their home, and she went to a Russian city which was and it's still called Samara, although during the Soviet regime it was renamed and the name was at that time Kuibyshev. However, that old traditional name has been returned to them.
And no, it's called Samar, S-A-M-A-R?
Yes, Samara.
Samara, S-A-M-A-R-A.
Yeah. And that's where she spent all those, again, 5 years, because that's how long the war lasted. And she was working in a orphans asylum, I should say, yes. Because there were so many small children which have lost their parents during the war, or got just... well, anyhow, that's what it was.
So it's orphanage.
Yeah, it was an orphanage.
So they both left Lithuania around 1915?
1914 for my father,
14.
Probably 15 for my mother.
And then they returned when it became independent.
Once there was peace again, they returned to their homes, although my father was sent to Panevėžys right away.
So they were escaping the Russian, the first Russian, well, this wasn't the first Russian occupation, but this was a time of deportations, the first wave of deportations to Siberia.
Actually, not yet. They escaped the front. They escaped the Germans, really.
In World War One.
In World War I, yes. And after the Germans were defeated and they retreated from Lithuania, then they came back to Lithuania again.
And why were they fearful of the Germans? They did not see them as liberators of Lithuania from the Russians?
No, they didn't regard them that way, no.
So they were very hostile.
Actually, it was more or less voluntary. If you remained in Lithuania, you had a very hard time. In Russia, the order was more established regime, so that they were supported as refugees. Russians supported them, their citizens, former citizens, and Germans they didn't. They were quite cruel, as you see from my father's history, and they were afraid of Germans at that time.
Your grandfather's history.
My grandfather's, yes.
Yeah. So then, so they both fled to Russia, and they both returned right before Lithuanian independence.
Yeah.
After the Germans were defeated.
Yeah.
And they met in Panevėžys, got married.
Yes, and they lived in Panevėžys all the rest of their lives. Yeah.
And then tell us about your, what else do you want to say then about your mother and your father?
Well, they were really noble people, and they were active not just professionally. They were active in community activities and causes, and they really were giving all they had to the community, to Lithuanian nation, which they loved very fervently. And
Were they religious?
yes, they were both Catholics, and they were religious, active in their religion, yes.
And is your parish church still standing in Panevėžys?
Yes, I don't have the picture of it right now, but if you go to Panevėžys, you'll see that's called Peter and Paul, Petras and Povilas Church. Mm-hmm. It's a red church, red building, standing. It's really closest church to my home, my house.
And were your parents pretty strict?
Well, I wouldn't say that they were strict. They were rational about my upbringing. I never was punished severely. I don't remember that I was, although I was had my share of slapping.
Yeah. We're looking for another picture of them. Is that them?
Yes.
Okay. Let's put this picture in here.
This is my father and my mother and myself.
This is from the magazine Rimvydas, 1997, Spalio 11 through 17. It's an article about
my family.
About you, basically.
About me, yeah.
That you're a real person.
Yeah.
And so tell us about your family life and your brothers and sisters, or your sisters.
Well, this is my sister, the oldest sister that was 2 years younger than I was. And I had two more sisters. Only one is living now. Excuse me. And that's the way we grew up.
So this sister is Laima.
Laima.
Laimutė, and this is her gravesite. She died of appendicitis.
Of peritonitis, which developed after unrecognized appendicitis, unfortunately.
So she was only 7 when
she was
she
8
died?
years old when she died, yeah. And the other pictures, I suppose we'll see them later.
Pictures,
they would be here.
So we found here a photograph, a nice photograph of your parents in their youth, maybe a wedding photograph?
Could be, yes. This is their first photograph. They didn't have any children at that time.
Okay, and then here's
and here is
the next
myself,
one in the series.
Myself when I was, probably 2 years, not even 2 years old, probably.
And those beards and mustaches were very stylish at that time, huh?
Yes. My father always, that's the way I remember him. I don't remember him without mustache and beard. And here already 2 of us children. And
this is Laima and you.
Yeah, and that was just about the time when she died.
Right before she died.
And here I'm already older and with 2 sisters.
Okay.
This is Niole and Felicia. Felicia is still living in New York, Long Island.
And then Niole went to Montreal.
Yeah, Niole went to Canada, and she died rather fairly early age. I think she was only 47 when she died.
Okay, and then here's another picture of the family.
This is extended family. Myself, my cousin Vytautas, my cousin Apollinaras, my sister here, and here is my aunt. I think I named them all, didn't I?
Yes.
Mhm.
All right. And this Apollinaris was someone that lived with your family?
Yes, his father died and they had a hard time. His father died when he was in his 30s, and they had a hard time. So my mother just took him in and provided the education in the high school until he graduated from high school, and I lived with him in the same room for 5 years.
And he was born on the same day that you were born?
He was born at the same time. What a coincidence, is it? No?
Yeah. Who, by how many hours were you older or younger?
That I don't remember. I don't know. I couldn't remember it, but never asked about it. Never knew about it.
And now, how about this one here? He's a cousin?
He is a cousin from my father's branch.
And what was the last name?
Vytautas.
Vytautas?
Yes.
And then the last name was?
Dubininkas, yeah.
Okay.
And he, at this time, he also lived with us, but just for 1 year. He also went to a special educational school for carpentry. He was a carpenter, basically.
And then this aunt, was that a close aunt?
Yes, she was father's sister, and Agota, that's it.
Agatha.
Agatha, and we called her Agute. And she again lived with us in our house.
And you say she was a pessimist. You can tell from the photograph.
Yes, she was always thinking about voicing her opinion about death and sorrow and so on.
She lived through a very difficult period of history.
Yes, that's true.
And then here you are again.
This is my first communion picture. At that time, the first communion was given only when you reached 10 years of age. And that's what I was, 10 years old.
So let's go back to your house in Panevėžys. This is your piano. Is that piano still in that house?
It was when I visited Panevėžys in 1986, which makes this piano probably about 75 years old.
Uh-huh.
But I don't know if it still existed at this time. I doubt it.
All right. So these are just some snapshots of Panevėžys in the wintertime.
Yeah. My parents had it doesn't show, it will show later. This is just snapshots, yes. But they raised silver foxes.
Oh yes, there is a picture of a fox right here.
Yeah. And that was a good source of their income too, because they were in a style, and everybody wanted, all the women wanted to have a silver fox. They used to wear them on their necks. And right now, at this time, you can hardly see them. They are just went out of style.
So they're not red foxes.
No, they're silver foxes. They were, their pelt was dark black with grayish sheen, so to speak. And it really looked like silver when they were running around.
Now, who would have to slaughter these foxes?
Well,
Would your father do it, or?
usually a hired man would slaughter them, although in 1 year I had to do it myself. didn't like it, but there
And
was
these
no,
were almost like
no-
pets, probably.
No, they were not pets. They were still wild animals. They were in cages. You could never pet them or something like that. They were wild.
So these are pictures of Apollinaris. Now,
Yeah.
you had this camera at age 16, so he was 16 by then, right?
15 or 16. That was one of the very first pictures that I took with my camera. I didn't have any understanding how to use the camera. Just snapped the best I could.
Who are these cousins here?
Probably my sister and her friends.
All right, let's move on. Here's a big group shot of you with cousins and friends.
This is cousins, yes, and
Well-
this was my picture taking practice, learning how to do it.
Here's cousin Viktukas Dubininkas.
Vytukas, yeah.
Vytukas
Yeah.
Dubininkas
yeah.
lived with
Mhm.
them for a short period and became a policeman.
Yeah. But he didn't like to be policeman. He resigned.
And this him as well?
That's him, yes. Posing with his gun
That was a cousin on your dad's side or your mother's side?
on my dad's side, yes.
And then here's cousin Alpa in front of your house.
Yeah.
That's who planted those trees? The village, the town of,
The town, yes.
and they're
And
still standing now.
And mark this view because you'll see the trees, how they look now. You'll see the difference.
Which street is this here?
This is Liepo Aleja, yes.
And these are liepos, linden trees.
Linden trees, yes.
Okay. And then who's this?
This is Alpa, Apollinaris. The whole row is Apollinaris.
Okay.
He was at that time just fooling around with a bicycle, with something else, and I was just snapping the pictures. This is remembrance from the country. Views from the country that I...
And actually, you can still see very similar views, even in 2003. But this is, they're harvesting the rye.
Yeah,
So the rye is still attached there.
that's right, yes.
And then they make the Lithuanian bread.
Yeah,
All right, should we move on?
yes.
And here's a picture of Dad here. This one is you, we think.
Yes, it is me. And some views. This is my mother's heritage.
Okay.
Uh,
So we talked about that in the
Yes.
northeast Lithuania
Yeah.
by the Latvian border.
yeah,
What was the name of that kaimas again?
Kraštai.
Kraštai.
Kraštai was the name of the...
And here's your mother,
No, this
No, that's
is
a cousin.
This is my cousin.
Felicia Bagaslauskas.
That's right, my cousin.
Cousin on your mom's side.
Yeah, feeding some ducks and so on. This is my pet. This used to be my pet, a young, very young kitten, and she stayed with us for a long, long time.
And what was her name?
I don't remember her name anymore.
And here's a visit to your dad's.
Grishka Budis, yeah, to my father's home.
Birthplace. You took a ferry down the river?
Yeah, from Kaunas we took a boat.
On the Nemunas or?
Yeah, on Nemunas. and just went towards Klaipėda. And about halfway through Klaipėda, we got out, and
Probably at Jurbarkas.
yes, just about that's where we stopped and aligned. And here, our relatives, more or less distant relatives, were meeting us, and that's where I took some pictures of them.
So this is Ketur Naujienų Mokykla, where your dad worked for 1 year
For 1 year, yes.
before fleeing to Russia.
That's right.
Okay.
And this is my father's uncle, who was famous who became famous later on because he was active in smuggling the Lithuanian books at the time when they were forbidden in Lithuania during Russian occupation, the first Russian.
Knygnešiai.
Yeah, that's right. That's why they were their name. Yeah. Mhm.
So what was his involvement with the Knygnešiai?
He was a priest in the small town at the border. The name of the town was Sudargas. It was standing right at the border with Germany.
Let's find that on the map. Hang on. We found Sudargas on the map here. It's right along the Russian border, what's now the Russian border, but used to be Prussia.
And my grand uncle, he was a priest there, and he sort of had his the Russian the Russian officials in his pocket. He bribed them, and they let the books, Lithuanian books, which were printed in Prussia at that time, in German print. Well, they were Lithuanian books printed in Lithuanian, but they were made in Germany. And he just they would cross the border, and the Russians would just ignore that those wagons of literature, of books, and then they were through the channels which my grand uncle knew about. They were distributed all over Lithuania. So thousands, probably not just thousands, but tons of books were spread that way.
All right. So he's pretty famous then to have such a nice memorial.
Yes,
Is that his
he's
gravesite?
known. Yes, it is. It is.
And that's in Sudargas.
That's right. Yeah.
All right.
Well.
Let's zoom in on this one. Antanas Sideravicius and Sinliamonas.
Saliamonas.
Solomon.
Yeah.
So tell us about these people. Antanas
Well,
Sideravicius.
And my grand uncle.
Granduncle Antanas.
Rather the grandfather who perished. His name was Saliamonas, and my cousin's name was also Saliamonas, and that's one of them here. It's hard to see. The other cousin was Antanas.
Okay. So here's an interesting picture. You visited Klaipėda. Your uncle, Juozas Bieliūnas, who had a radiophonic orchestra.
Yes.
An orchestra that played on the radio then, huh?
That's right, and he was the chief of that office of orchestra. And he invited me to go when the orchestra went to Klaipėda for gastroles. I went with him, and I spent 3 weeks in this town, in this harbor town in Klaipėda. And this is the view of the orchestra itself, and the other are views just the way the town looked at that time.
And now, did he play an instrument?
He was a singer himself.
That was your brother's, or your father's brother,
No,
or
my
mother's
my
brother?
mother's brother, yes. He was, his name was Bieliūnas.
Okay.
He was also famous in a way because when Lithuania, after gaining independence, organized the opera of Lithuanian opera, he was one of the pioneers that created that opera, and he performed in the very first performance of the opera, of new established opera, in the first season.
What was, the opera of which city?
The opera was in Kaunas, and they performed Traviata, Verdi's Traviata.
So these are views of Polish-occupied Vilnius.
Vilnius,
And
yes.
how often were you able to visit Vilnius when you were little?
When I was little, not at all. Nobody could visit Vilnius at that time. It was only in 1938 that the border was opened. Before that, the Lithuanian government left the border closed as a protest against the occupation, because our understanding was that the Polish people, or the Polish government rather than people, they occupied Vilnius against all the rules of national understanding.
So now, so did you go to Vilnius when the borders were open in 1938?
Yes,
You were
in
16 years
1930
old?
Yes. I
Yeah.
think I was already, it was, I probably was already 17 years old at that time.
And what was your impression of Vilnius?
Well, it was it was very interesting to see Vilnius, which we dreamed about for a long time. And however, the fact that it was governed by Polish people, government, that was painful to us, because we always regarded Vilnius as our city, our capital city of Lithuania, and all the history is entwined with Vilnius. And here they were, Polish troops were marching through that city, so it was painful. But these are just separate pictures.
What do you remember of Vilnius when you first went there? The architecture, or?
Well, I remember the most impression I got from that town was that church, the famous church, cathedral also, but the Peter Paul Church was more impressive and more interesting than cathedral itself.
You don't have a picture of that
No, I don't
church
have
here, but
that,
this is
yeah.
the cathedral. So you just like the architecture and art of the Peter Paul Church?
Yeah, this is very elaborate and really Baroque architecture with statues, with ornaments. They really, I remember them. I remember that for a long, long time.
What about the old town of Vilnius, just walking through the sort of medieval streets?
Yes, it was it was more better preserved at that time when I was there, during my first visit. Later, when the front or the war activities crossed Vilnius, first one way and then the other way, then many buildings were destroyed. But what you can see now when you go to Vilnius is probably just 80% of what I first used to see during my first visit.
Well, here are your high school years.
Yes.
So you were trained in a sort of a military element.
We had military education, that's right, but just in the last year of school, and just once a week, 1 hour a week.
But you were issued a uniform and a gun?
No uniform, no. This is school uniform.
Ah.
Yeah,
And-
you can see the school. We had black suits. That was our uniform, school uniform.
Did you ever think you would be fighting for Lithuania at that time?
I was ready to fight even at that time. If somebody would tell us to go to Vilnius, especially, we were really sorry that we didn't regain Vilnius ourselves. They were sort of given out to us by Russians in a way, by Soviets.
So what year then this was 1938, so this was,
Yeah, 38.
this was right before the start of the war.
Yes.
Did you know that there would be a big calamity?
Well, in 39, it was evident that Hitler was going to expand his borders beyond the present ones. And they started with Poland. They vanquished Poland, and they started, then invaded Russia, and at the same time they started the war with France and England, and finally he lost all of those.
But what was going on in Lithuania while all this was happening?
Well, as I said, first we just really were witnessing how Germans vanquished Poland. We were still neutral at that time, and we had more or less normal life, although the times became a little bit, gradually became harder and harder. And because of the war conditions. And then in 1940, in June 15, the Russians occupied Lithuania.
So did you know that the Russians would occupy, or did you think that the
Just-
Germans?
Just in the past, say in about 2 weeks before the occupation, the Russians started behaving so illogically. They made requests from Lithuania which were just impossible to comply with. So at that time we knew that something was brewing and that the Russians became more and more dangerous. But that was just in the past, in the 2 weeks prior to our actual occupation.
So things happened very quickly then.
Yes, to us it was very sudden.
And
And
so the
quick.
next pictures here are already, no, this is your high school.
Yeah, my graduation from high school, yeah.
So what can you tell us about the people in this picture? Here's you, first of all, in
This is
1941.
the basic picture, because shows all the graduates of my class.
This is 1940, so you were
Yeah,
18.
I was 18, yes. And this is just really twice as many youngsters graduated from that year, but this was our class. We had that parallel class. We were taught English as a foreign language, and the other class, our other friends who were in different classroom, they learned Russian instead of English. So this is our class, and this is our, how to say, home teacher, I suppose. he was a priest himself, Roshkis. And this is myself. This is my friend, my class, my
Classmate that you
soulmate. How do you?
Seatmate?
Seatmate, yeah.
Sat next to you in a double seat
That's right.
for
We
all
had
4 years?
All 4 years, yes.
And what was his name?
Jokubas. And he was Jewish.
What was his last name?
Schreiberis.
So Jacob Schreiber.
Yeah, Jacob Schreiber he was. And during the war he perished himself. And this, my friend, he also perished. He was killed by Germans.
Was he taken to a concentration camp?
Well, to ghetto, so to speak, which was just one step from concentration
That
camp.
was in first of all, so this is Panevėžys here.
Yeah.
So he was taken to a ghetto in Panevėžys?
No, the ghetto was not in Panevėžys, the ghetto was in Šiauliai, in another town. And he had to go there, and his father was doctor. And for about 2 years, they let him practice the medicine because there was no other doctor in that town. So we thought that maybe he'll be saved. But yet, after 2 years, the Germans murdered the whole family, his whole family.
How did you learn about that?
Well, there was no official announcement, and through friends who were living close to that town. I have described that in my memories in more detail. And he was also a good friend of mine. These two were sitting behind us, behind Jokubas and myself. And he was killed sort of by accident during the uprising of Lithuanians uprising when Germans came in at the same time. And that was in 1941 when the Germans occupied Lithuania.
So the Russians came in first and then the Germans.
And then Germans threw them out.
And who were the more ruthless of the two groups?
Well, the Russians were more ruthless. With Germans, you can at least argue. With Russians, there was no argument at all. If you insulted them, you had to go to concentration camp.
But the Germans obviously were more ruthless to the Jews in Vilnius.
Yes, that's right. Germans, they really had special hate for Jews. And he also perished. He was a genius in mathematics. His name was Yasukaitis. And when the Russians finally came back after 3 years or so, again he perished rather without any senselessly.
He was killed by the Russians?
He was killed by Russians.
And how, in what way?
I understand that that when the front came through Lithuania, he was just trying to hide from the artillery, and some Russian decided he was hiding for some obscure reason and just shot him. The Russians also were very lax about people's lives.
And then this is Arvydas Žygas' father.
That's right, yes, that's Žygas.
So you knew him probably here in America?
Yeah.
Any others from your
class?
class?
Living in Cicero, and I knew him. And the others, I maintained some, this is Grinius. I maintained a correspondence with him once we could write to Lithuania. and the others.
So the only two that made it to America were
No,
you and
This
him?
was his name is Rimvydas, and he was Karaim.
Oh,
Karaite.
he's a Karaitis. So
Karaitis,
was he
yes.
Muslim?
No,
They have
they
their
were
own
not
religion
Muslims.
now.
They actually, I think they were distorted. They had distorted Judaism as their faith.
And the story has it that Vytautas Didysis brought them over
That's-
from the Crimean Peninsula.
That must be true because they really were living in groups from that time, Tartars and Karaite.
And you can still see them around Trakai.
That's right. Yeah.
And they actually have a church in Vilnius too, or I don't know, it's called a mosque, I believe, isn't it?
It has a special name which I forgot, but it's not a mosque. No.
It's more Jewish than Muslim.
That's the way I understand that it is that way. Yes.
So some were living in Panevėžys then, huh?
They were really a colony of Karaites, and I think there were something like a dozen of Karaites in our school.
Mhm.
Although he wasn't the only one in my class.
All right. So this tape is about to end.
Yeah.
This is Vienna. What is this after you left Lithuania?
Yes.
Well, let's save this for part two then on our
part two,
next
because,
tape.
Yeah, because that's a long story.
Okay.
How I had to leave Lithuania when the Germans closed the university, and for a while there was no way to study, no way to continue the studies.
So you were able to stay under Russian occupation, under the first Russian occupation.
Yes, for a year and 7 days I was under Russian rule. They wanted to draft me into Red Army. They probably would have drafted but they had to leave. They were pushed out by Germans before they. The first steps, I had to undergo the first steps, the medical examination for the Red Army and so on and so on.
So you were studying medicine in Kaunas